elderly millionaire was kicked out of an elite car dealership because of his clothes. A few hours later, when he returned, everyone was shocked by his act. An elderly millionaire named Richard Hartman, who had made his fortune in real estate and wise investments, was hardly the picture of a typical wealthy man. With his old jeans, weathered flannel shirt, and simple sneakers, he could have easily been mistaken for someone just finishing a day's work rather than a man with an impressive portfolio. Living a modest lifestyle was something he valued. To him, it was a statement of his roots. He had grown up with very little and had never forgotten where he came from. One particular morning, Richard decided it was finally time to treat himself to something he had always put off: a luxury car. Not just any luxury car, but one of the most prestigious brands in the world. For years, he'd been driving a modest SUV, but as he grew older, he wanted to indulge in the thrill of having a high-performance vehicle. He knew he could easily afford it, but he'd always preferred reinvesting his money into community projects or growing his businesses. This time, he wanted something just for himself. Richard had set his sights on a rare model he had read about, a custom-built car with all the top specifications. He'd done his research and discovered that only one dealership in the city had it in stock. Excited, he decided to visit this elite dealership in a bustling part of New York City. Without much thought about his appearance, he slipped on his usual clothes and walked through the city, blending in effortlessly among the crowd. As he entered the dealership, he was greeted by polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the gleaming reflections of luxury cars that lined the showroom. He felt a twinge of excitement as he saw the sleek model he'd read about, standing there like a masterpiece on display. He made his way towards the car, but before he could reach it, a sharply dressed sales associate intercepted him. "Sir, can I help you?" the man asked, his tone polite but his gaze assessing. Richard nodded, explaining his interest in the car, and asked if he could take a closer look. The sales associate's eyes narrowed as he took in Richard's appearance. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a high-end dealership. Our cars require serious buyers with the means to make a purchase. Perhaps you'd like to look at something more within your budget at one of our other locations." Richard blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He wasn't used to being judged by his appearance, especially not in a place where he was more than capable of purchasing anything on the floor. "Actually, I'm very interested in this model," he said, keeping his tone steady. "I'd like to speak with someone who can assist me." The salesman sighed, clearly uninterested in wasting time. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have strict policies about test drives and access. This is a luxury establishment, and our clients usually, well, they meet a certain standard. We reserve the right to serve genuine customers." Richard felt a flush of anger rise. He could tell this man had no idea who he was speaking to. Decades of hard work and humility kept him from lashing out, but he decided he would not tolerate this kind of treatment. He gave the salesman one last chance to redeem himself. "Are you sure you don't want to reconsider?" Richard asked. "I'm in the market to buy today." The salesman barely concealed his impatience. "Sir, I think we both understand the situation. If there's nothing else, I'll have to ask you to leave." Without another word, Richard turned and left the dealership. As he walked down the street, his mind raced. He wasn't one for petty revenge, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being judged so unfairly. It was then that a bold idea began to form. A few hours later, Richard returned to the dealership. Only this time he had taken a different approach. Richard's idea had been sparked by a mix of indignation and amusement. He had dealt with people like that salesman throughout his career, individuals quick to judge by appearances, and he knew exactly how to handle them. He made a few calls to some old business contacts, arranging for something a bit dramatic to happen that afternoon. If the dealership was going to judge him based on looks alone, he'd give them something to truly remember. The first call he made was to his assistant, Mary, who had been with him for over 20 years. Mary knew Richard better than most people and wasn't the least bit surprised when he explained his plan. She laughed, knowing that once he set his mind to something, he would follow through. Richard asked her to contact the managers of his various companies, instructing them to clear his schedule for the day. He wanted to make sure he could see his plan through to the end without distractions. Next, Richard called a high-profile lawyer who specialized in luxury contracts and transactions. He explained the situation, laying out the finer details of the car he wanted and what he expected from the dealership's response. Afterward, he contacted a private car service to send a limousine to his current location. Richard decided he would give this dealership a taste of the extravagance they valued so highly, and, if he had anything to say about it, he would leave a lasting impression. An hour later, Richard found himself seated in the back of a sleek black limousine, heading back to the dealership. This time, he wasn't wearing his usual modest attire. He had donned a tailored suit from one of the most exclusive designers in the city, a gift from Mary on his last birthday. His shoes were polished leather, his cufflinks a simple but elegant silver. If appearances mattered so much to this dealership, he'd make sure he met every single one of their unspoken standards. The limousine pulled up to the dealership, and a valet rushed to open the door for Richard. Stepping out, he noticed a few employees watching him, their eyes widening as they took in his new look and the car he'd arrived in. Richard held back a smirk, determined to keep his expression calm and composed. Inside the showroom, the same sales associate who had dismissed him earlier stood by the entrance, chatting with a group of colleagues. As soon as Richard stepped in, the salesman's face changed. He glanced at Richard's attire and the way he carried himself, clearly recognizing the hallmarks of a wealthy client. The salesman hurried over, an eager smile plastered on his face. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome back," the salesman said, his tone much warmer than before. "I believe you were interested in one of our models earlier. I apologize for any inconvenience. We'd be delighted to help you find the perfect car today." Richard's eyes met the salesman's, and he took a moment to savor the man's discomfort. But he wasn't here just to make a scene. He had a plan, and it was time to set it in motion. "Actually," Richard began, his voice calm and steady, "I'm here to speak with the owner or manager of this dealership. I believe they'll want to be involved in this transaction." The salesman's face faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure, nodding and gesturing for Richard to follow him. They walked through the lavish showroom, passing several employees who cast curious glances in their direction. Soon, they reached the office of the dealership manager, a sharp-looking man in his 40s who was reviewing documents at his desk. "Mr. Stevenson," the salesman said, "we have a client here who would like to speak with you directly." The manager looked up, his expression one of mild curiosity. He rose from his desk, extending a hand to Richard. "Welcome to our dealership, sir. My name is Charles Stevenson, and I'm the manager here. How can I assist you today?" Richard shook the manager's hand, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. I appreciate your time. I was in earlier, actually, but it seems there was a misunderstanding regarding my interest in one of your cars." Mr. Stevenson's brows knitted together as he glanced over at the salesman, who shifted uncomfortably. "I see. I apologize if there was any inconvenience. We value all our clients and aim to provide exceptional service." "Indeed," Richard replied. "And that's precisely why I'm here today. You see, I'm looking to purchase the limited edition model you have in the showroom, the one that's advertised as custom-built." Mr. Stevenson's eyes lit up. He had been hoping to find a buyer for that model for months. "Of course, sir. It's an excellent choice, one of the finest in our collection. I'd be happy to discuss the details with you and arrange a test drive if you'd like." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds good. I'd like to proceed with the purchase today. However, I think it's important to discuss the terms of service here first." The manager hesitated, clearly taken aback by Richard's tone. "Terms of service?" "Yes," Richard said, crossing his arms. "You see, when I visited earlier, I wasn't dressed like this. I was wearing my usual clothes, which may not have fit the image you have of your typical customer. Because of that, I was treated as though I couldn't afford to be here." Mr. Stevenson's face paled as he glanced back at the salesman, who looked positively stricken. Richard could tell that both men understood the situation now, and he wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. I don't usually dress in designer suits or arrive in limousines, Richard continued. But that doesn't mean I'm any less capable of purchasing the car I want. Today, I'm willing to buy your most expensive model outright, but I want assurance that others won't experience the same treatment I did. The manager stammered, trying to find the right words. Mr. Hartman, I apologize for any offense you experienced. Our staff should have never treated you that way, and I assure you, we'll address this immediately. We pride ourselves on our reputation, and we certainly don't condone such behavior. Richard studied the manager's expression, satisfied that his message was getting through. But he wasn't finished yet. Richard gave a small nod, acknowledging the manager's apology but making it clear that words alone wouldn't be enough. I appreciate that, Mr. Stevenson, but I'd like to see some concrete action. I've worked hard my entire life, and I know the value of treating everyone with respect, regardless of appearances. My success didn't come from judging people by what they wore or the car they drove. I believe a business, especially one as prestigious as yours, should stand by those same values. The manager, clearly uncomfortable but realizing the gravity of the situation, nodded. I completely understand, Mr. Hartman. Please rest assured, we'll be implementing changes in our customer service training immediately. We'll ensure every client receives the utmost respect and attention, no matter how they're dressed or their perceived status. Richard looked over at the salesman, who was fidgeting nervously, clearly regretting his earlier treatment of him. I'm glad to hear that, but I'd like to propose something further. I want this dealership to make a donation to a charity of my choice, an organization that provides opportunities for underprivileged youth. I'll match whatever amount you choose to contribute. The room went silent as the weight of Richard's request settled over them. The manager blinked, then quickly nodded, realizing this was a chance to not only salvage the dealership's reputation but also do something meaningful. Absolutely, Mr. Hartman. We'll make a significant donation, and thank you for giving us this opportunity. If you could share the details of the organization, I'll make sure the funds are transferred by the end of the day. Richard felt a sense of satisfaction as he watched the manager's response. This was no longer just about his own experience. It was about turning a negative encounter into something that could benefit others. He hadn't come back to the dealership just to prove a point. He wanted to use this moment to make a difference. Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. I'll have my assistant send over the details, Richard replied. He turned to the salesman, whose face was now red with embarrassment and regret. And as for you, young man, I hope you'll remember this experience the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on appearances. It's easy to make assumptions, but it takes real character to treat everyone with respect, regardless of what they're wearing. The salesman nodded, his face a mix of shame and relief. I apologize, sir. I was wrong, and I won't make that mistake again. Richard allowed himself a small smile. He knew the man had learned a valuable lesson, one that he hoped would influence how he treated future customers. Good, Richard said, turning his attention back to the manager. Now, let's finalize the purchase, shall we? The manager, eager to move forward, gestured for Richard to follow him to his office. As they went through the paperwork, Richard noted the changes in the staff around him. They were more attentive, more respectful. It wasn't lost on them what was happening, and he could tell that the entire team had learned something from the encounter. After completing the transaction and ensuring the donation would be made, Richard prepared to leave. The manager and staff, now fully aware of who he was and the impact he had made, gathered at the entrance to see him off. Richard shook hands with the manager and glanced once more at the salesman, who looked both humbled and grateful. As he stepped back into the limousine, Richard reflected on the day's events. He'd come to the dealership to buy a car, but he was leaving with much more than that. It wasn't about the car or the money. It was about using his influence to encourage change and create a ripple effect of respect and kindness. With one last glance at the dealership, he settled back into his seat, feeling a sense of fulfillment. He had proven that true wealth wasn't measured by possessions or appearances, but by how one treated others, and that was a legacy worth leaving behind. As the limousine drove Richard away from the dealership, He took a moment to reflect on what he had just accomplished. He had spent years quietly amassing his wealth, investing in businesses, and supporting community projects, but today felt different. This time, he had used his position and resources to make a statement in a way that others wouldn't easily forget. But as he leaned back, a new thought crossed his mind. He realized that the issue at hand, judgment based on appearance, was something he had encountered frequently throughout his life, and it was a problem that went beyond just one dealership. Inspired by this experience, Richard decided to take things a step further. He wanted to reach a larger audience, to spread the message of respect and humility across industries. He knew that he had the means to make this happen, and the encounter today had shown him how much of an impact he could make if he was willing to stand up for his values. The next day, he contacted a team of media experts he had worked with in the past and laid out his vision, a campaign to raise awareness about prejudice and bias in luxury spaces. He wanted to show people that wealth didn't have to mean arrogance, and that real class was about how one treated others. Within a week, his team had crafted a strategy, complete with online videos, testimonials from others who had experienced similar treatment, and partnerships with major brands that supported his cause. Richard also reached out to other business owners he knew, inviting them to join him in this effort. Many of them, inspired by his story and his commitment, agreed to contribute funds to the campaign and even implement changes within their own companies. It wasn't long before news outlets caught wind of the movement, dubbing it the Respect Revolution. Social media picked up on it too, and soon the hashtag Respect Over Riches began to trend. In the weeks that followed, Richard received messages from countless individuals who shared their own stories of being judged or dismissed based on their appearance. People from all walks of life, teachers, blue-collar workers, artists, reached out to express their gratitude for his efforts to shed light on an issue that was rarely addressed publicly. Many admitted that they'd felt invisible or undervalued simply because they didn't fit the stereotypical image of a valued customer. Richard read every message, responding when he could, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose with each one. One day, as he was reading through his messages, he received a particularly touching note from a young woman named Ava. She shared that she had once been denied service at a boutique because of her casual attire, despite saving up for months to buy herself something special. Feeling humiliated, she had left the store and vowed never to return. But after seeing Richard's story, she felt empowered to speak up. Inspired by his campaign, Ava started a social media account dedicated to highlighting businesses that treated all customers with respect, regardless of appearance or background. Her account quickly gained a following, with people from all over the country sharing positive experiences and highlighting companies that upheld the values Richard stood for. Seeing the impact Ava was making, Richard reached out to her directly, offering his support and resources to help her grow her platform. He admired her courage and resilience, and he knew that with the right support, she could amplify her message even further. Together, they planned a collaboration that would provide resources and guidance to young people facing similar challenges, equipping them with tools to advocate for themselves in spaces where they might otherwise be overlooked. The Respect Revolution began to snowball, catching the attention of major players in various industries. CEOs, celebrities, and public figures voiced their support, sharing their own encounters with prejudice and the importance of empathy. More companies pledged to train their staff on anti-discrimination practices, and some even began offering discounts to customers who dressed casually, as a nod to the movement's roots. Months passed, and Richard's efforts continued to ripple outward. What had started as a single moment in a car dealership had grown into a nationwide conversation. Richard hadn't just bought a car that day. He had sparked a change in attitudes and inspired people to reflect on how they treated others. But even as the Respect Revolution continued to gain momentum, Richard remained the same humble man he had always been. He still wore his worn-out jeans and old flannel shirts, and he still took walks through the city without an entourage. The wealth he possessed had never defined him, and he wanted the world to know that true value came from within. One afternoon, as Richard was walking down a busy street, he saw a young man holding a sign that read, "Respect isn't in what you wear, it's in who you are." The man smiled and nodded at Richard, who smiled back, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that this message was reaching people, and it filled him with pride to see others carrying it forward. Richard's journey with the Respect Revolution began to shape not only public conversations but also the very way he viewed his role in society. He began to realize that his wealth, while originally a means of security and stability, had become a tool for positive social change. With each passing day, he received invitations to speak at conferences, participate in panel discussions, and even consult with companies looking to reform their own practices. Richard found himself immersed in a movement that had evolved far beyond his initial expectations. A turning point came when Richard received a call from a well-known national news station inviting him to be featured in a documentary series on social justice and advocacy. At first, he was hesitant. He had always preferred working behind the scenes, letting his actions speak for themselves. But as he considered it, he realized that sharing his story on a larger platform could inspire even more people. Reluctantly, he agreed to the interview, and a few weeks later, he found himself in a studio, seated in front of a camera, recounting the story of his encounter at the dealership. The documentary aired to wide acclaim. Viewers were moved by his humility, his dedication to his values, and his willingness to stand up against prejudice. Stories like his resonated with people from all walks of life, and the Respect Revolution gained even more traction. It became a common topic in workplaces, schools, and community gatherings, sparking conversations about kindness, empathy, and treating others without judgment. As the Respect Revolution grew, Richard realized that he could do even more to make lasting change. He established a foundation, the Hartman Foundation for Equality and Dignity, focused on creating educational resources for businesses, schools, and community centers. The foundation provided workshops on topics like implicit bias, empathy, and the importance of inclusivity. Richard saw this as a way to instill the values he held dear in the next generation and to help businesses understand that respect was not just a moral obligation but a powerful asset. To his surprise, other philanthropists, CEOs, and community leaders reached out to him, wanting to support the foundation. What started as a small project soon became a national initiative, with resources distributed across the country and partnerships with schools and organizations that championed inclusivity. The foundation's work extended beyond luxury spaces, addressing everyday interactions in workplaces, retail environments, and even online spaces. One of the foundation's major initiatives was a scholarship program for students who demonstrated a commitment to social justice and inclusivity in their communities. Richard knew from his own experience how challenging it could be to make a difference without the necessary resources, so he wanted to empower young people to lead change. Each year, the foundation awarded dozens of scholarships to students who showed outstanding leadership in advocating for others, helping them pursue higher education and advance their missions. Meanwhile, the dealership where it all started had undergone its own transformation. After Richard's visit and the resulting media attention, the dealership faced intense public scrutiny. Determined to rebuild their reputation, they took several steps to improve their customer service policies, implementing training programs and donating a portion of their profits to the Hartman Foundation. Richard was pleased to see that his experience had inspired real change within the company, and he remained in contact with the dealership's manager, Mr. Stevenson, who expressed his own gratitude for the valuable lesson they had learned. Over time, Richard's modest lifestyle and unassuming demeanor became something of a legend. People admired him not only for his wealth but for the integrity and humility with which he wielded it. His story was shared in classrooms, discussed in leadership workshops, and even adapted into a best-selling book that documented his journey from humble beginnings to successful businessman and advocate for equality. Despite the accolades and recognition, Richard stayed true to his roots, continuing to walk through life with the same humility and kindness that had guided him from the beginning. One day, as Richard sat on the porch of his home, he received a message from Ava, the young woman whose story he had read after launching the Respect Revolution. She had just graduated college and had used the support from his foundation to create her own nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering underprivileged youth. She expressed her deep gratitude for his mentorship and support, sharing that his story had inspired her to believe that anyone, no matter their background, could make a difference. Richard read her message with a smile, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. He realized that the movement he had sparked had grown far beyond his own influence. It was a reminder that the truest measure of success wasn't in wealth or possessions, but in the positive change one could bring to others' lives. The Respect Revolution continued to gain momentum, eventually becoming a movement woven into the very fabric of American culture. Schools across the country integrated Richard's story into their curricula, teaching children about the value of respect, empathy, and the dangers of judging others by appearance alone. Colleges held workshops inspired by the Respect Revolution, and businesses, from small shops to global corporations, began implementing Richard's principles as part of their customer service training. Richard's story was no longer just his own. It had become a shared lesson that people from all backgrounds could relate to and learn from. Richard's foundation, the Hartman Foundation for Equality and Dignity, became one of the most respected nonprofit organizations in the country. With an annual gala that brought together leaders from all sectors, the foundation raised millions of dollars each year, all of which went toward scholarships, community grants, and educational programs. Richard never ceased to be amazed at how something as simple as standing up for oneself could grow into a movement that touched millions. The dealership where everything began became a shining example of transformation. Not only did they become known for their exemplary customer service, but they also developed a scholarship fund for employees who wanted to further their education. Richard had planted a seed there, and under the leadership of Mr. Stevenson, it grew into a model of how businesses could evolve and become forces for good. As for Richard himself, he remained deeply involved with the foundation but kept to his humble roots. His personal life was quiet, surrounded by close friends, family, and Mary, his trusted assistant who had become like family. Despite the accolades and honors, Richard remained the same modest man who once walked into a dealership in worn-out jeans and sneakers. The only difference was that now the world knew his story, and his message had resonated far and wide. Years passed, and as Richard grew older, he reflected on his life with a sense of peace and satisfaction. He had never expected to become a public figure or to start a movement, but he was grateful that he had. He had turned a moment of judgment and dismissal into a legacy of respect and dignity. A legacy that would live on in every person who embraced the values he championed. One sunny afternoon, as he sat on his porch reading a letter from a scholarship recipient, Richard realized that he had achieved everything he could have hoped for. The Respect Revolution had become self-sustaining, driven by the countless people it had inspired. He knew that even after he was gone, the movement would continue, fueled by those who believed in the simple but profound idea that respect was the true measure of a person. In the end, Richard had proven that wealth, titles, and appearances were all secondary to kindness, empathy, and the courage to treat others with dignity. He had left behind more than just a financial legacy. He had left a legacy of character, one that would ripple through generations to come. Even in his twilight years, Richard continued to receive letters, emails, and personal visits from people whose lives had been changed by the Respect Revolution. Some were strangers who had heard his story and felt compelled to share how it had inspired them. Others were recipients of his foundation scholarships, who had gone on to accomplish incredible things in their own right. They were doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs, and community leaders, each carrying forward Richard's values in their own unique way. One particularly memorable visit came from a young man named David, who had been one of the early scholarship recipients of the Hartman Foundation. David, once a struggling student with dreams of becoming an architect, had been able to attend a prestigious design school thanks to Richard's support. Now, as a successful architect, he had worked on projects across the country and had returned to personally thank the man who had believed in him. With tears in his eyes, David shared how Richard's story had not only given him a chance at education but had also taught him to never judge anyone by their appearance, a principle he now carried into his own life and work. Hearing stories like David's filled Richard with a deep, indescribable joy. These individuals were living testaments to the power of empathy and respect, and each success story was a reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. To know that his actions had rippled outward, touching lives he'd never even imagined, was a fulfillment beyond any financial achievement he had ever reached. As Richard's health began to decline, he made one final decision to secure the future of the foundation and the Respect Revolution. He called upon a close group of trusted friends and advisors, including Mary, who had been his steadfast companion through all these years. Together, they developed a succession plan that would allow the foundation to operate independently, ensuring that its mission would continue long after he was gone. They expanded the foundation's reach to include international initiatives, supporting communities around the world and sharing the core message of respect and dignity. In his final days, Richard reflected on his life with a sense of peace and contentment. He had come from humble beginnings, had worked hard to achieve his success, and, in the end, had used that success to uplift others. He had never sought fame or recognition. He had only ever wanted to be true to himself and his values. His life had been a testament to the belief that true wealth was measured not in material possessions, but in the positive impact one could have on others. After Richard passed away, a quiet but deeply felt sadness spread among those who had known him, from his closest friends to the countless people whose lives he had touched. But even in their grief, there was a shared resolve to honor his legacy by continuing the work he had started. The Hartman Foundation held a memorial service in his honor, attended by hundreds who had been impacted by his life. Among them were scholarship recipients, business leaders, teachers, and community members, each with their own story of how Richard had inspired them. At the memorial, Ava, the young woman who had started a nonprofit inspired by Richard, spoke eloquently about his life and legacy. She recounted his story, his humility, and his commitment to respect. She spoke of how he had shown the world that kindness and integrity were more powerful than any amount of wealth. As she finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation, not for a man of wealth or status, but for a man who had dedicated his life to the simple yet profound belief that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. In the years that followed, the Respect Revolution continued to grow, spanning borders and touching lives in ways Richard could never have imagined. Schools taught his story as part of their curriculum, businesses adopted his principles, and individuals everywhere carried forward his message of empathy and respect. Richard Hartman had left behind a world that was kinder, more understanding, and more compassionate, all because he had dared to stand up against prejudice and champion the value of every human being. And so, his legacy lived on not in buildings or monuments, but in the countless acts of kindness and respect that had become his true, enduring monument. The Respect Revolution had become a permanent part of the world's collective consciousness, a reminder that the greatest legacy of all is one built on love, empathy, and the courage to see beyond appearances. Richard Hartman was gone, but his spirit lived on in every person who believed that respect was a gift everyone deserved, regardless of wealth, status, or appearance. His life had been a beacon of hope, and his legacy a promise that as long as there were people willing to uphold the values he had cherished, his influence would never fade. In the years that followed, Richard Hartman's legacy flourished, his impact felt in ways he would have never anticipated. The Respect Revolution became a beacon of hope, inspiring a culture shift across industries and communities worldwide. Schools, businesses, and communities honored his memory by embedding his principles into their foundations, ensuring that his message of respect, kindness, and integrity continued to touch lives long after his passing. People from all walks of life carried Richard's story with them, a reminder that true wealth lay not in appearance or material possessions, but in the heart and character of each individual. His life had shown the world that small acts of empathy could create waves of change, and that treating others with respect, regardless of status or appearance, was the truest mark of greatness. At the Hartman Foundation's annual gala, attendees would gather, sharing their own stories of how Richard's message had inspired them. They celebrated not only his achievements but the lasting change he had sparked, a change that grew stronger each year, carried forward by all those who believed in his vision. In the end, Richard's legacy wasn't a monument or a plaque. It was the countless acts of kindness, empathy, and respect that had been inspired by his life. He had left a world better than he found it, proving that a single person, guided by humility and conviction, could indeed change the world.